Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of another new report from the OECD. What can schools do to develop positive, high-achieving students? I'm Natalie Pereira, the Chief Executive of the Education Policy Institute, and we're delighted to be hosting this event today. You can find out more about our organisation by visiting our website, www.epi.org.uk, or following us on Twitter. Also, feel free to tweet about the event this morning using hashtag OECD PISA or hashtag OECD TALIS. Now, in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Andreas Schleicher, who's the Director of Education at the OECD, and he'll be taking us through the key findings of today's report. And then there'll be an opportunity to put questions to Andreas about those findings. Andreas will then be joined by two esteemed panelists, Vanessa Ogden, the CEO of Amartya Academy Trust in London, and Brett Wigdorf, who is the Chief Executive and founder of Tiny, an early years and childcare organisation. So please use the chat function to submit questions to Andreas and to the panel. We're looking forward to having a really informative and engaging discussion this morning. Now over to you, Andreas.
Well, first of all, thank you, Natalie, for hosting us and for your great support for our work at the OECD and TALIS in particular over the many years in the past. The report that we are launching today represents a quite novel approach. You know our PISA reports where we regularly assess student learning outcomes. You know our TALIS survey where we regularly survey teachers on their views of the working environment, the work organization, their policies and practices. But then, people ask, well, what teachers say, does it actually, matter in terms of student learning outcomes? And so the obvious answer is combining those two data sets. And that's exactly what this report does. And we are fortunate to be able to do that because there were a number of education systems that choose to survey students, teachers, and school leaders in the same schools using both instruments. So this is not a large group of countries, but it's the pioneering group of countries that was able to integrate the PISA and TALIS data sets so that we can actually link those two sources. And I think it's providing a fascinating way of looking at the TALIS data in new ways in terms of the kind of practices that teachers, use that actually shape the learning outcomes of students. And I must also say, it's not only, the integration of data sets, it's also a very ingenious way of analyzing the data. My colleague, Normin Redonnet, has been a mastermind of this, developing new AI-based methods to actually comb through those data and conditions in schools. So that's really what this report is about. Why do we do this? Because we see that expenditure keeps creeping up. Now, that's something that most countries have in common. When you look at basically expenditure per student on primary to tertiary education, you see an average growth rate of 1.3% in net terms, even after adjusting for changes in price levels. So that's quite serious. And in a number of countries, that growth has been quite steep. And at the same time, when you look at learning outcomes, we haven't seen that much change. And in a moment of crisis like this presents a formidable dilemma for public policy. Now, this current health crisis will put, tight limits on public spending over the medium term, and that puts pressure on education to deliver superior value for money, and therefore to look harder at how we can use our resources most effectively, how we can, combine the people, the spaces, the time, the technology in ways that actually deliver the best possible outcomes. So I think this is a very timely, very important, very relevant analysis. And that's what this report really is about. Now, let's talk about some of the results. The first thing that we find is actually what teachers do, and report actually does make a difference. Now, that's the first encouraging insight. You link the data from teachers and you can see actually learning outcomes are shaped by this. You also see that whether you talk about reading, mathematics, and science, there is actually a surprising level of performance variation among schools in a fair number of countries. Now, overall, you can say about 30% of the total variance in student learning outcomes lies between schools. So where you enroll does matter in terms of your student learning outcomes. Now, particularly so in countries like Turkey or the Czech Republic, less so in countries like Malta and Denmark. Now, but overall, it's a significant share of student performance variation that lies between schools. That's very important, and that is not just true for learning outcomes. We can see the same thing when we look at some of the social and emotional outcomes here, like disciplinary climate and teacher enthusiasm. Also those vary across schools, a little bit less than what we could see in the outcomes part, but is, depending on where you go to school, you will find more or less enthusiastic teachers and better or worse disciplinary climate. So in a nutshell, schools do matter. Now, obviously, what we see in these charts is two phenomena that are interlinked, or that can mutually reinforce or moderate each other. Now, what the school does and whom the school teaches. Here, what you can see here is a kind of combination of school policies and practices and segregation in the student population. And one needs to disentangle those two factors to find out, what is really due to what teachers do as opposed to just who they teach. And you can see, for example, the Czech Republic is always among the countries with the largest between school variability. And at the other end of the spectrum, I already highlighted Denmark, having very little performance variation, and also, social emotional outcome variation and teacher practices variation that lies between schools. And some of that is explained, by the level of stratification in an education system. You can see that here very well represented, how many options or choices or institutional programs are available to 15-year-olds. And you can see in the case of the Czech Republic, there's a lot of variation. You can go to academically, vocationally oriented schools of different types, whereas in Denmark, everybody goes to the same kind of school. So that's one of the reasons why there is less between school variation. But you can see even in Denmark, where there is no kind of differentiation in the school, outcomes vary, and teacher policies and practices vary. So that is important to keep in mind, that schools differ, and those differences do make a difference. Now, the first kind of takeaway from this survey. But obviously the most interesting thing is, what are those factors that matter the most, or that relate most closely to the outcomes of learning? And this is basically a summary here. And I distinguish here between direct effects. Now, what you do is directly related to outcomes, and indirect effects. What you do, is mediating other kind of more direct factors. And when you look at the, then we also distinguish between school level factors and teacher factors. When you look at the direct links, classroom characteristics are related both to student achievement and to students' social and emotional development. Now, when I talk about the perception of classroom climate, the perception of teacher enthusiasm, the perception of difficulty of the PISA test, to what extent did students feel that that test was actually challenging, and also their educational expectation. We can see the same for school culture. Now, those variables also were quite closely related to both dimensions. And then teacher dimensions, the classroom practices. I'm going to come back to this in more detail, but you can see clear linkages between this. On the more indirect factors, we could see a link between teacher well-being and satisfaction with their jobs. It's something that works more indirectly, but it's related to those outcomes, and also the use of the working time, even though in ways that might surprise you. I'm going to come back to this. So let's look at those factors in more detail. The first thing is something that probably isn't going to surprise you very much. What teachers do in the classroom matters for both student achievement and also for the social emotional outcomes that we measured, particularly student behavior in class. Students, as you can see here, tend to perform better on average the more class time teachers spend on actual teaching and learning. Time on task. That's basically also very well established in the research literature. borne out by these data, and that can have, two sides of the coin. One is basically you can spend more time on task when your students are less disruptive, but it's also a matter of how you organize learning time. So it does come back to teacher policies and practices. And so the findings line up quite well with the research literature. So basically a 1 percentage point increase in the average class time that is spent on actual teaching and learning in the subject leads to quite significant change in PISA scores. Now, when you think about, 35 points are equivalent to a school year, you talk about really a kind of important difference, not just a 1% point increase in time on task is something that you can actually see in terms of outcomes. So that's, I think, something very familiar. But here's something that, people will be puzzled by maybe at the surface. Now, the more teachers spend time on marking and correcting student work, the higher student performance is now. So the way teachers use and allocate their working time across different professional activities seems to be related to student performance as well. Now, as the amount of working hours that teachers spend on marking and correcting increases on average within the school, now that's how we measure this, students tend to perform better academically on average across the countries and the economies that are taking part in this PISA TALIS link. How do we interpret this? It could be that, more highly competitive school environments that are attended by higher performing students can lead to more frequent feedback to students in the form of tests and exams. No? It could be that actually, providing, regular feedback and assessment to students is one of the driver of learning outcomes. There are many interpretations, but as you can see here, actually, spending time, a 1 hour increase in the average time that's spent by teachers on marking and correcting student work is actually related to a substantial gap in or advantage in learning outcomes. So, appraisal, assessment, feedback seem to be things that matter. We can also see that spending quality time with students outside the usual lessons is related to learning. Here you can see that the more teachers spend on extracurricular activities, the more students report that the classroom is disciplined, that the teacher is interested and motivated to teach, and that they expect to complete, higher levels of education, in this case, a tertiary degree. So actually that relational component, do teachers work with students outside that kind of classroom context, seems to be predicting, a fair number of important outcomes, of which I'm showing you here one, namely the change in the student perception of classroom disciplinary climate that is related to a 1 hour increase in teachers' engagement in those extracurricular activities. But again, we can see the same thing also on other outcomes. So having teachers who know their students, who spend time with them outside the regular kind of lesson environment, seems to be related to better outcomes as well. The way teachers use and allocate their working time, again, here you can see also relates to higher student expectations. Basically, you could see here the 1 hour increase in the average time that teachers spent on marking and correcting students' work is also related to higher student expectations. That may be harder to interpret as well. How could this be that you spend more time on marking and your students then, aspire to higher degrees? There could be some composition effects here once again, that, schools that have higher achieving students tend to do more of that kind of testing and marking and correcting. But it could also be that it's the process of feedback where students get, more regular appraisal and feedback from their teachers. They develop higher academic aspirations, in addition to also showing better learning outcomes on the PISA test. So I think it may sort of remind us of the importance of the benefits of regular, frequent assessment, even if it creates more work for teachers. It will give teachers an up-to-date picture of how students progress, where they are, where they can be. It gives students a sense of, where they are, and those things could be beneficial for learning outcomes. Now, that's quite in contrast with a perceived kind of workload and stress among teachers. You could see, for example, adding 1 hour of teaching time is not, related to a big increase in teacher perception of stress. Adding more time, for planning or preparation of classroom, there you can see the relationship between, more work and stress gets stronger. And then comes the marking into this, where you can see that relationship becomes quite steep, and it's only higher when it comes to general administrative work. So it's an interesting contrast. Now, on the one hand, teachers say, that extra marking is a big kind of chunk of work for me, but you can see from the student side, it seems to be related to many positive outcomes in terms of, better academic outcomes, higher degrees of, better classroom climate, and ultimately higher education expectations. Now, again, we do not know what the causal nature of those relationships is. And again, it could also be in part a composition effect, the way students are selected to different schools and schools applying different policies. But it's something I think worth looking at, and it's the first time that we can uncover those relationships. Before we had this picture from TALIS, and we had, the picture on learning outcomes from PISA, but now we are able to integrate those two and put the picture together. And here I come to the indirect effects that I already mentioned. You could see the more satisfied teachers are with their work, the better students perform in their school. That's obviously, one of the important indirect links. And teacher-student interactions are also related to student behavior in their class. Our analysis shows that the more teachers spend on relationships with students, the more students perceive them as enjoying teaching, and the better it is for classroom disciplinary climate. I found this a really interesting relationship as well, that basically the teacher's perception, I invest in those relationships, and then you survey the students and you can see my teacher really likes to teach. And actually my classroom disciplinary climate is better. So you can see classroom disciplinary climate is not just a matter of, how strict you are with your students and the kind of disciplinary measures you impose, but very much of the relational quality with the students. And, something that may be obvious, but it's now quantifiable and measurable. Our results also show that students tend to find their teachers more interested in their teaching when teachers report lower levels of work-related stress on average in the school. Again, how that relationship works, difficult to discern, but you could see actually a perception of less kind of stress leads to a perception on the part of students that teachers are more interested in their teaching. And again, as you can see, teachers' job satisfaction matters for student performance. The more teachers are satisfied with their work environment, the better students perform in the school, as shown in the chart. All of this sort of could be a kind of self-enforcing dynamic. Let's get to another finding. The greater the number of teachers with a master's degree within the school, the higher students' educational expectations. This is where the research literature in part deviates from what we find in this report. Many people say, well, it doesn't really matter whether teachers have a master's degree. That's also something when you look at this in terms of the PISA results alone, you don't find any kind of a relationship. But here you do find that the level and quality of pre-service training seems to be related to students' expectations, their own expectations. Now, maybe, having teachers who have more advanced education raises those kinds of aspirations for students. We do not know the causal nature, and this is also something where the research literature has been quite variable, and one needs to see that in that context. And also you can see that teachers are not the only people that matter for students' academic and also social emotional outcomes. Classmates, as you can see here, seem to matter a great deal for students' performance and also for students' self-concept. I should add this. This is also what we find, not shown on the chart here. It's simply the presence of academically gifted students in the classroom could be, predicate better students' own performance. The greater the number of academically gifted students who are enrolled in the classroom, the more students feel able to succeed in the PISA test. as well. I think that's also an interesting finding, that the perception of success is stimulated by the people I have around me. And as you can see, they also tend to perform better on average. What this says about academic segregation, obviously, that speaks against other findings in the report. Here you can see actually that academic segregation and being in a high-performing, being the kind of small fish in a big pond is better than being the big fish in the small pond, in a sense, when you look at those results. So there is a clear kind of composition and peer effect that is visible in those kinds of data. Here's something again, that doesn't seem intuitive. The larger the class size, the higher students' educational expectations. In fact, we could even see positive relationships with performance on the PISA test, and also perception of the difficulty of the PISA test. And there could be many reasons for this. It could be simply that many countries put lower performing students deliberately into smaller classes to give them better support. That's sort of a deliberate kind of policy. It could be that, a larger class gets more high performing students around you. You see more diversity in learning outcomes, and therefore, you raise your educational expectations. There could be many explanations for this, but what's interesting is that it's the same trend in every country for which we have data. So it's not just, few countries that have, very large classes and high performing students, some of the East Asians, but it's a trend that we can see basically across the participating countries. And that's something I think worth to look into, because again, common sense has it, smaller classes give more personalized support and therefore lead to better outcomes. Well, that's not what you see in these kinds of data. Teacher and school factors that matter for low and high achieving students. Obviously, what I've shown you so far is just the average relationship. We've also looked at to what extent that relationship varies between high and low performing students. And actually the answer is no. That's actually a really interesting finding in itself, that most of those relationships hold across the entire performance spectrum. You can see basically, I think here's a chart. Yeah, here's a chart on this that what holds for the average, the class time spent on teaching, satisfaction with the work environment. Work-related stress is the only one where we see, has an impact more for low achieving students than for high achieving students. But then again, working hours spent on marking and correcting works at both ends of the spectrum. Concentration of academically gifted students works at both ends, and involvement of parent and local community in school as well. So we didn't find much, differential functioning of those relationships across the performance spectrum. Gender was also something that we looked at, and typically when we look to PISA, we look at the average difference in performance between boys and girls. But here's a chart that's actually shedding very interesting light on this. It actually looks at how is this relationship in performance between boys and girls varying across schools. And of course, you have to first discount the schools in pink here, where basically you have single gender schools. So ignore them, just look at the rest. But you can actually see there is, when it comes to performance in reading, a large group of schools where girls perform better than boys, and often significantly so. That's the blue bar. But there's also a large group of schools where there is no gender difference. And that, I think, is something that we should, take to heart, that this is not a universal fact, applying to every girl, every boy, and in every school. But no, there are some schools actually where gender differences are non-existing, and there are some schools where they are very large. And you cannot simply associate this with demographics. That works even after accounting for, social background and other demographics. So this is something that, it doesn't seem to be as inevitable as it always, seems, that girls do better in reading than boys everywhere. Now, what is associated with this? First of all, disciplinary climate. That seems something very clearly affecting boys a lot more than girls. Maybe boys are also more part of the problem of disciplinary climate than girls. But overall, you can see where disciplinary climate is poor, you generally have larger gender differences in reading outcomes. At least, that's what we can see in the countries on the PISA TALIS link. But more interestingly, we can also see the gender gap gets smaller when boys have more support from parents and teachers. Where you can see, for example, that teachers said student relationships are better, you can see actually that is something that diminishes the gender gap. And the same for parents and local community involvement. It's hard. I don't think we got very far in explaining that relationship, but it's an interesting finding that the kind of relational element in school seems to be benefiting boys more than girls. At least it makes a gender gap so that we can see quite sizably smaller. We also see that student assessment, teacher accountability, and appraisal are more beneficial to boys. Boys are more likely to perform as well as or even better than girls in reading in schools where a culture of student assessment, teacher accountability, and appraisal prevails. The more often teachers evaluate their students by administering their own assessment, the smaller the difference in reading performance between boys and girls, all other factors being the same. So again, does this suggest that boys benefit more from regular testing? Maybe that gives them the better feedback to self-regulate and focus on schoolwork. I don't know, but there is that relationship. And we also see that the more school leaders ensure that teachers feel responsible for their students' learning outcomes, something that actually teachers often report puts me under pressure that I'm held responsible for student learning outcomes. But also this, and also the more often teachers are formally appraised by external individuals and bodies, the better boys perform relative to girls. Again, a complex relationship, something that we need to study in more detail, but it's an interesting one, giving teachers opportunities to reflect on their teaching practice and finding ways to support low and middle achievers, again, among which boys are overrepresented in reading, could, address some of the gender differences that we observe in this kind of report. The TALIS PISA link also throws a light on whether a student performed better or not when taught by teachers of their gender. And our analysis shows actually in all three subjects that a student's performance tends to increase as the share of teachers of their own gender in the school increases as well. Again, puzzling relationship, but something worth looking at. It's not true in all countries. You can see in some countries this goes non-significantly to the other side, but you can see where we see significant differences. They suggest that having teachers of your own gender in your school is something that relates positively to your performance in all three subjects that we measured. So that's basically it in the report. Let me just wrap up with a few kind of remarks on what those findings could mean. Obviously, time on task, maximizing this is a good bet on raising performance. That works everywhere. Devote sufficient time to activities outside regular classes, extracurricular activities, regular use of formative and summative assessments, regular communication of progress to students, that feedback, appraisal, and then also reducing administrative tasks that take time away from teachers. Now on the marking, and it comes out differently. Remember that regular formative and summative appraisals of teachers in schools, not formative functioning of formal appraisal could not be too closely associated with high stakes appraisal for accountability purpose. We should, make a difference here. But, that kind of feedback and appraisal, you could see at least, particularly for boys, does seem to make a difference. Then the question of student grouping is a double-edged sword. Now, on the one hand, you can see composition effects work positively out for students, being surrounded by high achievers. At the same time, you can see also that having overall diversity of performances in your classroom can pull people up in terms of overall expectations. So I think our advice here is to spread out students with disadvantaged socioeconomic background and academically gifted students as equally as possible across the classes. It also sort of, optimizing the assignment of teachers to classes, matching teachers with varied backgrounds across the subjects and or the school years is something that could help. And then also linking other adults into this process. Teachers' work environment, you could see some really interesting results here. Infrastructure and material needs obviously matter, particularly in the most disadvantaged schools. You can see that very clearly. And then also fostering a school climate that is conducive to collaboration. Combining teacher professional autonomy with a collaborative culture, giving teachers sufficient autonomy over the core aspects of their work, and getting teachers involved in the decision-making in schools. When it comes to teachers' workload, it's not so clear, the findings. It's obviously always a question of how you balance workloads and the kind of stress that it induces. And also, to what extent does this work at the individual and school level? Open questions. You could see actually for lower achieving students, the prevalence of stress seems to be a positive predictor. So we need to sort of understand those relationships in greater depth. And then finally, family school partnerships. We can do a lot with home-based parental support, parent-child discussion and education, help with homework. You could see particularly again for boys, those do make a difference. And that's really all from this report. Again, it's the first time that we were able to systematically match what we know from teachers, what they tell us, with the outcomes that we observe from students. And you could see some results are as you expect, and others hold lots of surprises that some of them we still need to understand. Thank you again.
That was great. Thank you so much for that, Andreas. It's as ever informative and sheds light on some really important areas for education. And I think in this case, why policy that goes beyond education practice as well. And hopefully we'll come on to exploring that a little bit later with the panel. I'm going to turn to some questions that we've had from the audience, starting with a fairly straightforward question first. Why are only some countries included in your analysis of both PISA and TALIS?
Yeah, this analysis required that countries had administered both surveys in the same schools, the PISA and the TALIS survey, and that was only possible, or only some countries choose to do that. We did actually encourage all countries to do this, because it opens just so much more analytic possibilities without increasing actually the cost of the surveys, but it wasn't feasible for many reasons in the majority of countries.
Really helpful, thank you. And on the issue of teacher impact, we've had a question that says, it seems that teachers should spend more time marking and correcting work and more time doing extracurricular activities with students. However, teachers only have a limited number of hours per day. So what is the most effective way for teachers to spend their time without suffering from burnout?
Yeah, I think that's obviously the critical question here. That's why we need to look at these results in context of the stress and workload different activities induce for teachers. But I do think what we can discern from this is that in education systems where teachers spend a greater share of their overall time working with students in different ways outside the classroom settings, we see that the disciplinary climate is better. We see that the outcomes are better. So I think that time should not be shortchanged. Obviously, there are many factors you need to consider. And this is not just, how teachers spend their time. This is also how large we make our classes. If you, make your classes smaller, you'd have less, teachers will have to spend more time teaching, and they will have less time for other things than teaching. And those choices are made quite differently across countries. So there's a number of variables that you need to consider to develop the optimum. And I think that's very difficult to discern from these data. But I think what these data leave us with is the impression that actually, we should ensure that that relationship between students and teachers does not suffer from just, instruction. actually, or no, put it the other way around, that actually that we do invest sufficient time of teachers in building relationships with students outside the kind of instructional context, and that includes marking and providing feedback. That includes, other activities outside not extracurricular activities. No? And actually, this is not so surprising as a finding. It may be in a country like England, which has gone the other way around, where actually teachers are mostly absorbed in classroom teaching. But if you go to countries like Singapore or Japan or China, actually for them that is common. Teachers would spend a lot less time teaching than British teachers and a lot more time working on those extracurricular activities. Now in Japan, it's 8.5 hours per week, only that. So the traditions, what might be surprising for you in the British context is not so surprising in other countries where teachers do invest a lot of their time in those aspects.
Really interesting. We've had a good question from Kim, who asked whether there is a link between teacher remuneration and pay and student performance.
Well, that's something that we don't study in this report, because that's only something you can look at the system level. And we have data on this in education at a glance. It's a little bit patchy. There are some, countries where teachers are extremely well paid still, where, neither teacher well-being nor learning outcomes are very good. I would think about Luxembourg as an example, and vice versa. But overall, you do see that keeping teaching financially attractive and, more importantly, intellectually attractive is an important driver of the people you get and the outcomes that come out. That's something that you can see from education at a glance.
Thank you. And that's something that I'd want to explore when we bring in Brett and Vanessa in just a moment. We've had quite a topical question from Tracy in the audience. And Tracy has said, related to the idea that assessment has a great impact on learning, I'd be interested in hearing thoughts on the potential impact of new technologies, including self-graded quizzes, better evaluation, documentation, AI, personal tutors. What evidence do we have on all of those things, on the impact of those in increasing feedback, but without adding an additional burden on teachers?
Well, these trends are too new for us to be captured in this, and this sample sizes are way too small because of the incidence and intensity of those efforts not being so big. But I would agree, we should, very much, this holds such enormous promise. In a way, I would say that, one of the biggest mistakes that education has made over the last, few hundred years is to divorce learning from assessment. We fill students up with a lot of knowledge, and then, put a high-stakes test at the end to test all of this. And that usually narrows down a lot of what is being learned and taught. And I do think that technology holds that promise to reintegrate learning into assessment. While you study mathematics on a computer, the computer can study how you study mathematics and then make your learning experience so much more granular, so much more interactive, and so on. So I do think teachers in the future will have many more opportunities, and the question of marking may also go away, as computers become better and better in marking open-ended tasks and complex, student responses, and so the work of teachers in the marking may diminish. Still, I would argue that this personal feedback, what we may see here in the marking may not just be, the test, but it may also be the process of the teacher actually working with the student. Here's something that went well, and here's something where you need to improve. So I think, that component is probably not what you can digitize so easily. But I do think that technology holds very significant promise to overcome that kind of artificial, distinction between learning and assessment.
Yeah, I can see that. And as I say, it's a really topical area to be considering, given the current context. I'm going to take one more question from this session before we move on. And I'm really sorry to those of you who have submitted questions and we haven't got to them yet. But the final question for the moment is, The link between larger class sizes and learning benefits seemed to be the most surprising finding. How could we explore this relationship in more detail, and what further research avenues does this suggest?
Yeah, we need to be conscious that this is a relationship. We do not know necessarily the causal nature of that relationship. In part, it could be, made by our actions. Again, if public policy, puts less performing students into smaller classes to give them better support, then you have constructed that relationship that smaller classes do worse than bigger classes. So it could be, in some education systems, a deliberate outcome of public policy that we actually try to give people more support who are lower performing and therefore put them in smaller classes. It could be that, we find actually that the size of a class matters less than other things that teachers do. It's not a surprise that many high-performing education systems actually do have considerably larger classes. They want to give their teachers more time for other things than teaching, for supporting individual students, for building that relationship, for professional collaborative development and things like this. So it could be, that basically giving your teachers more time for other things than teaching through larger classes is a way to improve learning outcomes. There are many kind of theories that we could establish, and I think this is a relationship where I would not venture for any theory. It's a relationship that does not surprise me. When I look at the PISA results in themselves without the TALIS, I also see that education systems with larger class sizes tend to be better at the aggregate. But again, I think what the causal nature of those relationships is, it's a very complex question.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. I'm going to bring in our other two panel members now. So firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Vanessa Ogden, who is the founding CEO of the Marlbury Schools Trust, which is a multi-academy trust in London here in the UK. Vanessa is also an academic visitor at the UCL's Institute of Education and is the chair of a charity called the Fair Education Alliance. We also have joining us today Brett Wigdorf, who is the current CEO and founder of Tiny, which is an organisation that provides support to early years educators. And Brett is also the founder and former CEO of Teach First and co-founder of Teach for All. So a huge welcome and thank you to Vanessa and Brett. I want to explore a bit the link between teacher well-being and student performance. So we see a relationship between teacher well-being and satisfaction and student performance. Based on your experience on the front line, as it were, what do you think that policymakers or indeed school leaders can do to improve teacher well-being and job satisfaction? And if we go over to Vanessa first.
Thanks, Natalie. And it's obviously an extremely important question given the findings of the research, which demonstrates so strongly the value of teachers teaching in the classroom and having that very hands-on experience with students in pastoral care and also their wider learning. I mean, I think there are some really interesting things, as has been suggested already in your questions earlier and in the commentary earlier, about the way we structure our classroom system at the moment that have been really highlighted by the current situation around needing to go fully remote with teaching and learning aside from emergency field schools. And I think that has brought out a range of possible strategies to enable us perhaps to think in a more fine-tuned way about the way we run and organise our schools to allow for an emphasis on assessment and feedback. Assessment and feedback is something that we have known for some time is crucial, and particularly when teachers give really constructive, formative feedback directly to students quite personally. And we're also seeing that in this remote world that very personal feedback is then having an impact on other students also listening to it. So I think a range of assessment strategies that combine quick fire feedback in the way that Hegarty Maths does, for example, which is a very digitally accessible learning tool for students in maths, has very quick feedback. Students find that incredibly motivating. And it's possible for us, I think, to create quite similar ways of creating that feedback for students, whilst also then finding time and space for teachers to have that very direct conversation with students about their work. So I think, you know, looking at how we structure our provision going forward is going to be one of the key things that has come out of this current situation. I mean, if anything good could come out of it, you know, a way of revisiting the way we structure schools is one of them. And I think teacher workload is a real issue around marking and feedback. Really good constructive feedback is very difficult to structure and give. It's a complex thinking process for the teacher, and it's complex in terms of how you give it to people. So it does require proper time, and we've spent some time in the Trust trying to work through ways of doing that, because in the 15 years I've been head, that's been one of the critical things, I think, for us.
Great, thank you. Brett, over to you.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, no, I thought it was really fascinating, just because having seen other sectors also in the war for talent, you know, there's a few findings that were really interesting about it. One was just that teachers love teaching, and it was just interesting to see that the amount of stress that comes from an additional hour of teaching is relatively low, while the amount of stress that comes from an additional hour of admin is incredibly high. And I think no one goes into teaching to do admin. They go into teaching hopefully because they love teaching. And I think that's you know, an also exciting point about a lot of ed tech products and things coming out to hopefully get rid of some of the admin and support teachers in different ways to focus more on the pupils and the teaching. And you know, even seeing in early years, actually I've spent a lot of time in early years settings recently, and it's always striking to me seeing childminders or nursery workers who just actually are in these wonderful chaotic things and loving it. But if you ask them to deal with billing or something like that, they get very stressed, and you know, really their heart just sinks. And I think one finding is if you could just help educators focus on educating, that's a real winning proposition. I thought the other line around this that Andreas said, which is keep teaching intellectually attractive. And I think that's something which you see again in any sector, no matter what sector you're in, what profession you're in, you want to keep on growing and learning and finding yourself intellectually engaged in the latest practices of your profession. And certainly I've seen that, you know, I spent time in the Singaporean system, and they're amazing at it, teaching intellectually attractive and having great professional development, very similar to what, you know, top management consultancies or other companies do for their top talent. And I think if more, you know, and some of the best schools actually in England, I've seen that great head teachers do it really well, where they manage their staff in ways to find great educational and development opportunities for their staff. And to me, you know, any great school, any great system is really constantly thinking of ways to develop their staff, keep teaching intellectually attractive and help develop them. And that's a way to keep people in a much more exciting way in the profession, rather than just kind of throwing money that doesn't necessarily have as big an impact as you might want.
Yeah, and we might come back to that notion of how you keep teachers, particularly in some of the more challenging areas. Andreas, did you have anything to add on the kind of wider evidence about effective policies and practices to help with teacher well-being and workload?
Well, I think, you know, the quality of an education system can never be better than the people that you attract and how you support and develop them. I think those things are actually really well established. But Natalie, also the point that you just made about how do we actually better align the quality of teachers with the challenges in schools. And that's, again, a hallmark of most high-performing education systems, that they make it, you know, attractive for teachers to take on difficult schools and classes, both in terms of career opportunities, but also very much in terms of support. You're not left on your own devices if you take on a tough class of a tough school, but you're going to get the best possible kind of environment to do that. And I think that is also a very, very big question. In a way, I think much of our policies are about, you know, doing the same thing everywhere. We have this kind of system-wide blanket policies, a class of this kind of subject should be of that size. A teacher of that subject should get that level of pay. And I think we have to develop more nuanced responses that really reflect the conditions at the front line, and create the room for teachers. Another finding not discussed in this report, and not so much now, is the discretion that teachers have to be actually creative designers of innovative learning environments, not teacher professional autonomy in that collaborative culture. Again, a great predictor for system-wide outcomes. So I think these are findings that are difficult to discern from the data that we have here, because that's only, about a few variables, but that we see from our wider analysis.
Thank you, Andreas. So let's stick with that theme for a moment longer then. And Brett, I'm going to come back to you on the question of making sure, how do we make sure that we've got the best quality or highest qualified teachers in some of the most challenging or disadvantaged schools? Now, you founded Teach First, which puts graduates in some of the most disadvantaged areas and has been successful in doing that. What do you think needs to happen at a system level to enable that to that kind of allocation of teachers to happen more consistently?
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen that and so as Andreas, in other countries that Teach for All, but also in other ways. That I think if you go to any profession, professionals love a challenge, and they love the areas where they can use their professional skills in the best ways. So I think there's a few levels. One is to really help, show the best professionals that this is the way they can use their professional skills best, is in schools in challenging circumstances, which I think is usually the case. I think, with Teach First, certainly we focus something on this method called the War for Talent, which lots of companies use, which is all around, creating a real professional focus on something, really providing really outstanding support. I love the idea of keeping it intellectually attractive, ensuring there's great continuous professional development, creating almost a aura around it, and a mentoring relationship, and a cohort effect around it, and really selling the idea that, if in your profession you want to make the biggest impact possible, these are the schools where you can make that impact. And I think most people do go into teaching because they want to have an impact. They want to help change children's lives. There's the leadership aspect too, which I think, teaching is a leadership skill and a leadership profession, just by leading young people in a classroom. And I think really selling the idea that this is the way you can have the biggest leadership impact also is something we really did with Teach First. Again, I think the more you could take away, I really like the idea of just taking away the admin and taking away things that add additional stress, and really letting people focus on the job at hand is really important. And that was, I think, something we tried to do, was really just put people on a really clear path, helping place them in the schools, helping support them in the schools, just kind of, finding that clear path, especially for graduates or, some mid-career people, so that they can just focus on hopefully being as good a teacher as possible. I think, those are the different areas we focused on it. And I usually use the example of, like, if you look at other professions, like let's say the military, people don't join the SAS or special forces because they earn more money. They do it because, they want to be the best they can be, and because they want to make the biggest impact, and because they want to push themselves. And I think, it's the same in a lot of professions, and I think in teaching too. I think to really sell the fact that these are the schools where you can make the biggest impact and really help children the most is the core of why teachers should want to teach in those schools.
Thank you. And Vanessa, beyond what Brett has already said, what do you think, if anything, needs to happen to have a kind of more equitable distribution of teachers?
And I think, the mission is important. I mean, I think teachers are really hardwired to hope. I think Brett's right. We are a profession that enjoys challenge, and we're a profession that is deeply committed to change and for the better. And so, that kind of message of hope in there is incredibly important to the profession. You know, you wouldn't start teaching a lesson if you didn't expect that by the end, you know, your students would have moved on. You know, hope is kind of hardwired into the profession, really. I think the opportunities that schools create internally for teachers, you know, that shared intellectual curiosity about teaching and learning, that passion for the subject is something that's very strong. And the way in which you can be the best at your craft, you know, it's a master craftsmanship, really. I kind of describe teaching as a sort of generative art, really, because there are so many things going on when somebody really talented is teaching, as our teachers are, is really, you know, teaching and engaging minds. And that's the case both through the planning that they do, very carefully thought through planning, but also through the actual intellectual engagement of the minds that you're educating in front of you in class. And there's nothing better, actually, really, in my view, than the enjoyment of working that through together, either with a group of students or with a group of teachers and leaders. You know, that creative space is incredibly important. So how you create that and how you recognise the skill and the craftsmanship as well. One of the great things about Teach First that isn't often spoken about is that, you know, that recognition of Teach First and teacher training, therefore, is a really great training ground for any profession you could ever go into. You know, you get the best training in a teacher training qualification, I think is right. And that was a very central message, is still a very central message for Teach First, but it's not often spoken about. And people in business and industry who've taken on Teach First ambassadors, those that graduated from Teach First, you know, they want them because they've got that high quality training and leadership, and you know, it changed actually the conversation about teaching for quite a while. What I think would be really important now in policy terms is to continue to celebrate what teachers do and what educators do, and support staff as well, because support staff get left behind sometimes in the planning for training. So something we've done within our trust is to create a really great support staff development programme, and my colleagues that are doing that are enjoying it so much, and our support staff are enjoying it so much, and have a kind of gold standard of standards like the teaching profession does. So, you know, there are a range of things about how you recognise, celebrate and continue to develop the profession that I think are not, you know, they're not difficult things, they don't cost money, they're about how you recognise the value of people.
Yeah, it is interesting that both you and Brett have talked mostly about non-financial incentives, and I think a lot of the public debate has tended to centre around the financial incentives. Really interesting to hear that perspective. Vanessa, I've got a specific question for you that's come from the audience. When you were talking about the importance of giving personalised feedback, what are your thoughts on how personalised feedback can be given in situations where you've got larger class sizes and teachers are grappling maybe with significantly more than 30 pupils or so?
So, I mean, I think it goes back to the way that you, as a head teacher, school leader, structure the provision that you're making for staff in which to work, really. And I think if you have got large classes, you've got to create space whereby certain groups of students can have direct feedback in smaller groups. I do think that's important. I think one of the things that I saw done really well, actually, about 20 years ago now, so, you know, not long before I was head teacher myself, and what a school had to do, because they just couldn't get maths teachers, was to create very large classes with one maths specialist and teaching assistants working alongside that particular maths specialist. And it was the only way in which they could teach the maths curriculum, and that was quite common. Actually, it was just about the time that Teach First arose, because of the need for teachers so badly in this country and in those particular professions. And we're not far away from similar sort of situations now. So creative things can be done in order to then maximise the quality of feedback through those teaching systems, but then to find space, you know, one could think of a way where using digital technology, you could create lessons that students can work on either together or independently within class, whilst the teacher then creates smaller groups for feedback. So, you know, I think it's just about being creative with your time and thinking outside of the sort of conventional structure.
Thank you. Andreas, did you have anything to add on that question about how you balance the tension between personalised feedback and large class sizes?
Well, again, you know, if I look to some of the highest performing education systems, that's a combination they make quite deliberately. Now, when it comes to sort of delivery of content, they choose to use large classes to precisely to free up more time of teachers to spend individually with students. Now, that combination between teaching of large classes and personalized tutoring is actually two sides of the same coin. So I don't see them in contradiction. Again, you know, I think the question is, how do we can spend our money only once, and how do we combine the spaces, the people, the time, and the technology in a way that it achieves optimal outcomes? It's something that will require a lot of creativity. And again, that's, I think, where school autonomy really comes in, to actually find creative ways to design the kind of learning environments that helps their students best, rather than to use, you know, static formula that prescribe those kinds of numbers. But these are difficult choices. I think we also have to admit that the evidence base on this is still, you know, very, very limited. There's a lot of, you know, cultural elements involved in those choices, and I think, but overall, you know, if I, you know, were a policymaker, I wouldn't, and I had, you know, in a zero-sum kind of spending envelope, I wouldn't put my bet on a smaller class. I would put, you know, the bet on making the work of teachers as attractive as I can, and providing as much space for teachers to engage with students, and that would be my response to this.
Thank you. I wanted to cover a bit the findings about the impact and importance of parents and local communities, which can sometimes get lost when we think about, or when we talk about school and pupil attainment. So this report finds a strong relationship between parents and local communities on student outcomes. Coming first to you, Brett, what do you think are effective ways in which parents and local communities can support student engagement and outcomes?
I mean, it's interesting. As I was reading that, I thought of so many. I probably visited hundreds of schools, and I'm thinking Vanessa School is one of them. That, and you look at the best schools, and they just invite the community in different ways. And usually, you know, that's just something I just think they all have in common. I'm trying to think in my head, have I ever seen a really great school that doesn't invite the community in? And usually, I think something great schools have in common is they find ways to engage the community, to engage parents. I've seen schools where, I remember China had, who said they were hosting the local badminton things in the evening because it was a way to get the dads in a way that they couldn't otherwise get the dads involved in the education. And I just remember seeing schools which really struggled, which almost seemed like fortresses, where I think many of the school leadership were scared of parents, or, you know, saw it as like, this is our job, you stay there, we stay there, and almost like wanted to keep a separation from the community and parents. So, you know, I guess that would be the first thing. I think, you know, obviously it takes a village to raise a child, and you know, I think the best schools find ways to welcome the community, to include the community, to make it more of a holistic way to work together, you know, for the best of the child. I mean, in my own child, I've just seen one of the children. There's a WhatsApp group, and the teacher put themselves on the WhatsApp group and on lockdown. And I know my other child's teacher just wouldn't do that because it loves to keep parents away. And just the one that's in the WhatsApp group somehow has managed to get parents to do tons of stuff. And you just see the child's education so much better under lockdown because she's kind of using us, I think, in a very effective way. And I think sometimes schools feel maybe threatened to do that, but if they can do it well, you just see firsthand what an impact it can make for young people.
Thank you. Vanessa, how do we do this well? How do we do it better?
You know, I mean, I've always believed that that schools are the absolute heart of a community, and they are the kind of glue of the social fabric. I think in a lot of cases, particularly where disadvantage is high because the resources available to families at home are so scarce. Just even personal space. You know, I realised, you know, sort of 14, 15 years ago that personal space for people is one of the biggest hidden barriers. You know, if you've got no personal space to learn and to grow because it's very crowded, it's really hard. So to create that space for families within your school, you know, schools can do so much to work that social fabric, to create social harmony as well, and cohesion between people, and the place where people come together. And that's what schools should be about. Now, it's really challenging in some communities, and don't get me wrong, I do absolutely know that firsthand. But you have to start where people are, and it takes time. You know, you can't expect it to change overnight, although things can happen quickly at times. But it's essential. And if you start with social space and small numbers of people to begin with, and then you build it. You know, I've seen firsthand in two different schools that I was a senior leader in, where we did this, and it was successful. Two totally different communities in London, I have to say. And you know, so one just has to find the right way, and what you can't do is impose your own set of assumptions, your own cultural set of assumptions, particularly on people. You've got to start where people are. I think parents are entitled to it. I think they deserve it. Independent schools thrive on it. I think, you know, if we don't take that as a very serious part of the educational offer, then we are doing a disservice to the families that we serve.
Yeah, really good point about making cultural assumptions, I think. Andreas, anything to add on this issue of parental and community involvement?
Yeah, you know, I very much agree with Vanessa and Brett's notion that schools really need to be the hub, the center of society. And that's actually what they were when school was invented. It was when we industrialized schooling that we, you know, then said, you know, we keep, you know, schools should keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. But actually the origin of school was actually very much a center of society. And when you look at our PISA data, you can see the simple fact where the parents ask their children every day, how was school? Had a stronger relationship with student achievement than parental income. It's not about, you know, spending 3 hours of homework with your children. It's about, you know, having that, you know, showing your child that what they do in school matters to you. That relationship is so important. And actually schools can actively foster this. And, you know, I think the example Brett gave, you know, there's so many social initiatives, but I even think, you know, the instructional context, you know, why would you study hard in mathematics when you've never seen an engineer? And, you know, your best mathematics teacher is probably not an engineer either. So let's, you know, bring people from society into schools and, you know, show people what real life really looks like and what career prospects are. And particularly for students from disadvantage, their view of the world is often so myopic. And I do think there is so much that schools could benefit by bringing in, you know, society in a broader way. There are many of really, really good examples for this. But I do think that's something that we have in a way. I think the last, you know, decades have seen a kind of trend towards commodification of schooling. You know, students became consumers, parents became clients, and teachers became service providers. And I think it's taken away the heart of this exercise, that this is really, you know, a whole of society enterprise, where it's about everybody working together towards common goals that will produce superior learning outcomes. And in a way that is the secret that, you know, some highly, you know, inequitable societies have used to build an equitable school system.
Lovely, thank you. We're nearly at the end of our session. We have had a question from the panel, which I think is probably the right one to start to end on. So a question from the audience for the panel. They say that they feel that some results are pointing in different directions. So I think results from your study today, Andreas, and finding the right balance seems hard. And is there one specific policy or intervention that governments or system leaders should be focusing on to improve teaching and learning? So what's the one thing that you think policymakers should absolutely prioritise in this area? And I'm going to go to Brett first.
Oh, gosh. The one area policymakers should prioritize in this area. You know, again, like I think every OECD thing, PISA event I've attended, every paper of Andreas's I've read, you know, it always gets back to the teachers, doesn't it? If you want to improve education, it always gets back to that. And I often say in England, you know, if you were just able to find, you know, 15,000 outstanding head teachers, the education system could kind of be world class immediately, because there's so much that great leaders can do in the system in England. You know, and I would think if there's anything policymakers could do, is, you know, it just gets back to making teaching and school leadership just the best career out there. And it as Andreas mentioned, it's not just about, you know, everyone needs a good middle class wage or a living wage, but it's much more than that. It's you know, some of the things you see in the best systems around the world. It's ensuring people get great professional development, people feel part of a wonderful profession, they have, you know, some sort of professional autonomy, they get to be treated like proper, you know, professionals, like adults who can you know, actually learn and grow. They get opportunities to, you know, grow their knowledge base in lots of different ways. You know, all those things maybe do cost some time and money, and actually require, you know, a serious push. I mean, you know, it's very easy, I think, in England, at least, policymakers get very excited about processes and things like that, and moving systems around. They don't always seem that excited about, you know, teacher development or really ensuring that there's a great professional system out there. And you know, there's been some movements in there in the chart culture teaching and other things to try to do that. But I think, you know, the more policymakers can focus on that, like they do in a few other systems in the world, I think that can really improve things.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brett has made a really great point about value and importance. I would add to that something quite practical in the current situation as well, which is a real investment in two things. One of which the government is already doing, and the government gets criticised for things, but and this is a really important policy intervention recently. The finding and giving of laptop devices to disadvantaged students for their learning is making a significant difference. And I think the investment of practical technological tools for children in schools that don't have access to them is important, together with really enhancing the professional development around use of digital learning platforms in a way that is going to help with assessment and marking and feedback in the way that we've talked about before, but also sharing of professional development and sharing of professional practice. And there's a space for parents to engage with learning too, so that you're actually, you know, you could effectively run a remote school in its fullness, actually. Now, one wouldn't want to do that, ideally. One needs to have direct engagement with people, for sure. But if we had the ability to be able to cut and paste the sort of provision into a more complex and differentiated school provision for students that allows us to balance all these competing important things, then I think you know, that will take us a significant way forward for the future, which I think is going to be incredibly important too, just simply because technology is just such an important feature of every part of our daily lives now.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I mean, on that, we haven't really got into lots of detail about the current context and how schools and students and parents have had to deal with this massive shift in their daily lives and in the way they learn. You oversee a number of schools in London. What has that journey since kind of March last year, when schools first closed in England, at least? What has that journey looked like for you, and what do you think what can we take from it that, what can we learn our best lessons from here?
Well, I would say that somebody asked me this question yesterday, actually, and what I replied was that it has been incredibly painful to see, and bearing in mind that all my schools are in East London, and I work with principals, very dedicated principals who are absolutely committed to the service of the families that make up our schools, and seeing the amount of what you can only say suffering, actually, around either hunger. So when the stockpiling started, and people couldn't get access to food easily, because you need money, don't you, sometimes to engage in those kind of stockpiling activities. So having to run a food bank, lots of institutions have had schools have had to do similar things, I know, but we ran a very comprehensive food service by the end of the last lockdown period. And then just home resources, so not having access to devices, as I spoke about earlier, and health poverty, and recently seeing significant levels of bereavement in families, particularly this time. And I work very closely with Barts Health NHS Trust, and it's painful to see. So we have to, I think, realise that the things that sat below the surface have been really exposed in certain parts of our country, and we need to do something quite comprehensive about that to try to ensure that we don't have this level of suffering for people when we don't need to. This is a country that is wealthy, and so we do have to address that, I think, as a society in this country, because it's become so visible when previously it had become hidden. So that's the experience. All the things that we've talked about today are ways to address it, and I am really optimistic that we will deal with this and ensure that when we're through, we will have built a better place. We need to.
Absolutely agree. Andreas, over to you for the final word on what you think the key takeaway or priorities should be following your really insightful report this morning, and whether you think that priority becomes more or less urgent in light of the pandemic.
Yeah, Natalie, what makes education so interesting is that there isn't that single magic key which can change everything, and I think if this key would exist, I wouldn't be sure it would be in the hands of policymakers alone. But speaking on policy, obviously, this is about the profession. This is about teachers, and I think as a policymaker, you want to make sure that your teachers have a deep understanding of their subject, and that is well understood. You want to make sure that your teachers understand how different students learn differently and can genuinely engage with those differences. I think that's also well understood. What this report highlights for me as the single most important message is that there's a third element. You need to know your students. You need to be able to spend time with your students, with each and every one. You need to understand their dreams and passions. And that's also the part that relates for me to this crisis. I think what students will take away from this crisis is, who was the teacher who called me, who understood, who I am, who I want to be, when I struggled in these different difficulties. So I think that relational component is one that we tend to underestimate, and that this crisis has really brought to the forefront. Education is not a kind of transactional business. It's first and foremost a relational kind of enterprise. The last point I want to make, again, for policymakers, again, I think we often overestimate their direct influence on education. I really think so. But I think the one area where they could really make a difference is to help society make better choices between the present and the future. You know, if I go to China, you know, parents will invest the last resources, the last time, the last effort in the education of their children, the future of their country. Here in Europe, you know, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption. You know, that's why we are heavily indebted. We don't, and you know, I think that the test of truth for me is, you know, when the kind of worst of the pandemic is over, are we going to reopen our schools first, or the cinemas, or the shopping centers? And again, those are the signals. How do we value the present versus the future? Where policy, I think, could make a huge difference.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I think we're about ready to draw the panel discussion and the event this morning to a close. I want to thank our colleagues and friends at the OECD for choosing to partner with EPI once again. Andreas, very grateful to you for talking us through your report this morning. And of course, thank you to Brett and Vanessa for making the time to share their really valuable and highly experienced insights. There was a great quote on the chat, Vanessa, calling you inspirational, which I entirely agree with. So thank you both for making the time during what I know is a very busy period. For everyone who is still with us in the audience, if you visit the OECD website, I think there'll be information there on how you can get a recording of the webinar this morning, and also a link to the full report that we've been talking about today. Also, please take the opportunity to have a look at EPI's website. A link is in the chat, and follow us on Twitter. So thank you again, everybody on the panel, everybody behind the scenes, and all our audience today, including some really great questions. So until next time, thanks everyone, and take care.